What is crack-a-lackin', Hardwood Knocks listeners? I am Dan Favale coming at you with the ever, always fantabulous and ubiquitous Grant Hughes. Good friend, longtime colleague, and he works at Bleacher Report. Fantastic writer over there. Check out his stuff. We are back, better than ever or worse than ever, maybe a little worse for wear, but feeling okay, to continue our division look-aheads in advance of 2022 NBA free agency. We are on to the Southwest Division. If you've not checked out the previous episodes, we've been releasing them like wild, so go check them out. But the first question we have to get to, the most important question, is Grant, where's Kyrie Irving? I mean, how are you doing, Grant?
I'm feeling very Kyrie Irving today, and I'm Kyrie and Kyrie Irving, because that's all anybody's talking about right now. So those are the only words that I know. I'll try to make up some other words to talk about these other teams that Kyrie Irving is not on and may never be on. But yeah, we're gonna have to weave that in. I think it's unavoidable. That's what's going on. Unless when this runs, it'll be irrelevant because he'll be somewhere else.
Most likely the Lakers, it seems like at this point. We talked about it. I talked about it with Brian Toporek in the Atlantic Division podcast, and everything we said about it, this is terrible plugging, is just outdated at this point. And it released the day that we're recording this. So, but the Southwest, a lot of interesting teams here. Like Grant said, we will weave in Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant talk just to make it topical. We're not trying to force it, but just in the event those teams are linked to them. As a brief refresher for anyone who is new around these parts, we are aiming to do 10 minutes or less on each team. Grant and I have done, I'd say, like a mediocre job of sticking to 10 minutes or less on each team, but that's why we're not going like belly flopping in, talking about it. We're talking extension eligible candidates, but not about every extension or what the price looks like. But with that said, we're going to go alphabetically because we like to live dangerously, even though the alphabet is not our collective strong suit. And that brings us to the Dallas Mavericks, who incidentally might technically be like the only Kyrie Irving team. But I thought, before actually getting into their vitals, Grant, that this was funny. In the framing of the report of Kyrie's preferred teams, they noted how the Mavericks and Knicks are sort of best set up to do something, but they're both more focused on Jalen Brunson. That is, how far has the perception of Kyrie Irving fallen that Jalen Brunson is the bigger priority over him? And it's, look, I'd do the same thing. I want to make that clear. I'd 100% do the same thing.
It's Jalen Brunson summer. We just got to get used to it. Like every year that somebody defines free. Well, I mean, if Kevin Durant shakes loose, then it's Kevin Durant summer. But yeah, I mean, good time to be Jalen Brunson. Like you're in high demand. Like you've got all this leverage because your own team kind of needs you pretty badly, and some other teams want you like inexplicably badly, like the Knicks. And so it's just like really good, high on the list of guys you would like to be this summer is Jalen Brunson.
Good for him too, because I bet if the Mavs would have offered him that max, that we'll call it the Josh Richardson special, he would have taken it, but they didn't offer it, and now he's going to make probably close to double, rather than 56 million. He might be over 100 million. To the Mavericks vitals, though, their key free agents: Jalen Brunson, if anyone didn't see that coming. Notable non-guarantees: Maxi Kleber, his $9 million salary guarantees on July 3rd. They will let that guarantee. He's also extension eligible if anyone cares. Then the most important non-guarantee is Frank Ntilikina. $2 million is his salary. I imagine they would keep it, and they should, because he's their best player. Maybe their second best player. Luka's okay sometimes. Other notable extension candidates: Dwight Powell. Please, oh please, Mavericks, do not extend Dwight Powell. And then Christian Wood, who they just acquired. Notable trade exceptions: they have, look, it's expiring today as we're recording this. It was the Josh Richardson $10.9 million trade exception. I wish they would have done something to like sort of fold that over or used it. And I guess they still technically could. So this podcast might get outdated if they decide to use that trade exception. Otherwise, they don't have any really big ones as of now. Their best spending tool is awkward. I have it at the mini MLE because even with Jalen Brunson's hold, they're like really close to the apron. And so even if you lose Jalen Brunson, you're not going to open up unfettered access to the bigger MLE to where you're comfortable hard capping yourself unless you dump other salaries. So I have them at the mini MLE. If something weird happens with Brunson or they dump a bunch of salary, they have the potential to get to that bigger MLE. And then Grant, now that I rambled through that might have been the slowest vital read that we've had yet. What are your thoughts, general impressions, needs, priorities in free agency? I think it probably starts with Jalen Brunson.
Yeah, right. No, I think your preamble was necessary because they're kind of I don't know, it is complicated. They have a lot of moving parts, even, which is weird for a team that you could also just imagine kind of looking very similar at the end of free agency. I mean, I put them in the contender class. I think their needs are fairly clear, although I think it's difficult sometimes to like, because what we're saying is, well, it looked like they needed X, Y, and Z against the Warriors, who went on to win the title. So it's like you kind of have to, which they won't need that type of stuff. The problems the Warriors present are not the same as other teams. It's just kind of how it works. But so I think they need, additional shot creation is always great. I think you'd like someone, if you could, with their limited resources, that can put the ball on the floor more than Reggie Bullock can. Same with Dorian Finney-Smith. Both those guys are really useful, role players for this particular team, because when you have Luka, it's okay if your supplementary offensive guys have like one or two things they can do. And I think they need some rim protection that, like Maxi Kleber is a good shot blocker, but he's not the guy that stands in there and deters stuff around the rim. He's more of a switch guy. He's a good perimeter defender. I think they need someone in there that can kind of shut things down, because again, that's kind of where the Warriors started to have success in that series. And, whether that's an issue against a lot of teams, I don't know, but it was against a very good one. And if the Mavs want to be very good, then you got to worry about that stuff. I think there's the Brunson situation is obviously kind of top of the list. I feel like it's going to take $100 million to keep him. And as we talked about earlier, before we started recording, I think you said like, that's kind of an okay number for them. I don't know if it's an okay number if you're another team, just because you're sort of, I don't know. We know Brunson works well alongside Luka. We know that it's a good fit there. So maybe you're willing to pay a little extra. Plus, you send the message to teams around the league that if you come to Dallas and have success, you will get compensated. There's that element too. So, but after Brunson, they're looking at fairly like, low end free agents, which I don't know if we want to get to those now, but, playmakers, big guys that can block shots, like that kind of thing.
I agree with everything you sort of just said there. I do think the Christian Wood trade probably gives them a little bit more flexibility if they want to do anything on the front line. He's a really good offensive player, and I think there's more mobility to him on defense. And I'm very interested to see just what he looks like in a system where you have Kleber, Dorian Finney-Smith, Reggie Bullock, and then Jason Kidd did coach his team really well on defense when you look at sort of the barometers of like what they were able to do in transition, which I'm not equating to effort, but those are like more controllable, especially in certain lineup packages. And I also think, I had mentioned this at one point on the previous podcast, but Christian Wood averaging over 20 points per 36 minutes while shooting better than 59% on twos and 38% on threes during that span. The only other players accomplishing the same are Michael Porter Jr. and John Collins. And Michael Porter Jr. hasn't even played a ton. Christian Wood's played. So I think that gives them flexibility if they want to go for like a shot blocker type or all defense at like the 4 or the 5, because you have like Bertans and Powell and Dorian Finney-Smith will play the 4. So you can move around stuff there, but it feels like they need another front court component. I'm with you. The question I wanted to ask you is, if you're the Mavericks, would you go 5 years on Jalen Brunson, who turns 26 later this summer? Let's say what if he's willing to accept, the rumors the Knicks are going 4 and 100, which would be $25 million a year. Is he willing to stay? Like, what do you even get to at that point? If it's a 5th year, that's where it gets for the Mavericks specifically, because that takes him into, I think it's through his age 30 season at that point. It's like, he's a smaller guard. It'd be a thought process. And you're not, maybe the discount is that 5th year, $20 million. That's still 5 years, 100, and $20 million. That's something to think about, because they can't offer, those raises, like the 8% raises versus 4 or 5 now, like that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme. It's that 5th year that gives them the real advantage if they want to use it.
Yeah. I think my stance on it is, I'm not doing it unless I have to. Like, if he comes back, I want to see what the Knicks are going to do first, or I was going to say, or whoever else, but like it's going to be the Knicks if he's going to get a big offer.
I think there was even reporting that the Pistons were just, they have Jaden Ivey now, but that they were just out. Like, any team that you thought was going after Jalen Brunson probably looked at the arms race between Dallas and New York, was like, nah, we're good.
Yeah. This is you say it all the time, the whole, it only takes one idea to like set the market for a player. And like, Brunson has the one, like the Knicks are the one. And so if I'm Dallas, I that 5th year I'm keeping in my back pocket. And if I have to use that, and I just can't let him go, then yeah, I think I do it, just because it's too difficult to replace him. I would just one other note on it. It's not necessarily pertinent to free agency, but the Clippers are a team that has a bunch of like mid-tier salary guys to package up in a trade for a star, and Dallas has that too. with, say Tim Hardaway on the high end down to Powell at like 11, Hardaway is 19.6. You got Dinwiddie in there, you got Bertans. If they didn't have these encumbrances, on their first round picks based on the Knicks trade, which I think may stretch out to like 25. They don't know if they're going to convey until then.
I think their 2023 was top 10 protected, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll double check that. You're right, though. They can't trade a pick before 2025 functionally.
Yeah. So all that, I mean, they would be really set up well to, to consolidate and trade some of that stuff with draft assets attached for whoever, like you name it, in terms of big stars, but they just don't quite have the draft flexibility. I wonder if, they may not have to think about this unless Brunson is not back, but if they do need like a replacement or an upgrade, however you want to think about it, they're kind of halfway there to having like a really solid package to put on the table.
The thing they could do, and you would need Brunson's cooperation, is if you're losing Brunson, can you make that a sign and trade to New York where they're giving you that 2023 pick back, or just a 2023 pick that you're then sending to another team in addition to other picks to make stuff happen. This would be if they decided they wanted Kyrie or Kevin Durant, like that might be the pathway. Can you do something to get the encumbrances off that 2023 pick? What makes that tough is the Knicks are clearing cap space specifically just to sign Jalen Brunson. So they're calling your bluff. They're not there yet, by the way, though. So if they don't want to dump Cam Reddish, like maybe that's the mechanism through which you work. There's also like their best salary. They have salary matching tools that are short term, but like that Tim Hardaway Jr. contract after his injury does not look good. And that's why I feel like this team could technically be largely set, which is why you really don't want to lose Jalen Brunson, because your flexibility there to make any sort of replacement. I haven't even considered like free agency guards they could go after, because they can't get a DeLon Wright or a Tyus Jones. Like they just won't have the money. And so I'm for them. I think re-signing Jalen Brunson makes a ton of sense for them. I would probably give him a 5th year just because I don't think that the deal is going to end up it'll be detrimental maybe for New York. It won't be detrimental for Dallas because they have the ecosystem within which he can work well. Maybe he wants a bigger role, though. We saw it with Jeremy Grant, leaving a really good team for a shitty team. Jalen Brunson would be doing the same. There's nothing about the Knicks that makes you think that they're going to be better than the Mavericks anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, and like, unless it gets completely out of hand, I think I'm talking about Brunson, even if you got that 5th year on there, he might still be a tradable number. Like, it's not like that. It's not looking like it's going to be just this albatross contract, that they couldn't possibly get off of if couldn't use to move on with, they wouldn't have to give up their entire draft future to do anything. So it's like, I think he's going to be overpaid, but it's sort of that's just what you're going to have to do in these specific circumstances to keep him.
Do you have any free agency targets that you like, or even if it's trade targets for this team? I will say I had them as an Isaiah Hartenstein team, and then he probably might have been too expensive. I don't know if the mini MLE gets him. And now just Christian Wood, I think that renders that suggestion moot. That was one of my favorite destinations. Isaiah Hartenstein and Luka would have been hell of a pairing.
Yeah, I had him too. I mean, he's just going to be on most of these, frankly. So, but yeah, I agree. The Wood thing, just kind of, I don't know. I still think if you could get him for the taxpayer mid-level, like I'm doing it. But I don't know. I think Goran Dragic feels like kind of a likely just minimum signing. I forget where I read that rumored, but that makes sense to me. I don't know how much he'd actually play, but if it's a throw a bone to Luka type of thing, that makes sense. I had Bamba on there. I don't know I don't imagine Orlando is going to match almost anything in restricted free agency on Mo Bamba. And then like another kind of pie in the sky possibility is Kevon Looney. Technically the mini mid-level would be a raise, but I think the Warriors will pay him above that to keep him. And there may be 1 or 2 teams with even more spending power that are willing to go up to the full mid-level potentially. I wouldn't necessarily do that, but I could see a team or two convincing themselves that was worth it.
I thought this would be, and maybe it's more so if Jalen Brunson leaves. And again, it's probably then predicated on can you access the full non-taxpayer MLE. This would be a good Victor Oladipo team based off what he did in Miami to close last year. I also wondered if he's not a free agent, but like Kelly Oubre Jr. might be fun on this team if you can work out a trade for that. I know Charlotte's going to be looking to cut money. You don't really have a deal that's going to save them a lot of money, and he doesn't fit into that Josh Richardson trade exception that probably expired just as we were having this conversation about the Josh Richardson trade exception. This would be a great TJ Warren destination, I feel like, too. And I thought, if you're still looking to kind of juice up the front line, I still don't know what Chris Boucher is going to cost in free agency. He's 29 years old, which is why I would say they probably can't afford him. But it's also like, okay, Biggs, who, he's not like, he doesn't need to explode to be valuable, but the way that he moves, especially on defense, his appeal is there. So that would be curious. I also like Juan Toscano-Anderson for this team. Like, just fits the mold of, they have the Dorian Finney-Smith, Reggie Bullock, a bunch of versatile guys on the wings, or in like Finney-Smith's case, essentially a combo forward. And I think that's the level of signing that they're ultimately going to be looking at, aside from Jalen Brunson. And I say this in a good way, that I don't think their free agency / offseason needs to be super interesting anymore unless Jalen Brunson leaves.
Yeah, I mean, you're also forgetting that just once Frank Ntilikina realizes his full potential, as I'm sure you're anticipating, they won't need anything.
Listen, all I'm going to say is they didn't get to the conference finals with Luka before Frank Ntilikina. It was after they signed Frank Ntilikina that they made the conference finals.
Your galaxy brain just exploded on the screen. I don't know if people are going to be able to see that.
Are you ready to move on to our next team, which is alphabetically the Houston Rockets? I do not have them with any key free agents. Notable non-guarantees, Jae'Sean Tate has that $1.8 million team option. They have to exercise it by July 7th. They will. That being said, he's also an extension candidate, as is Kevin Porter Jr. and Eric Gordon. They're notable trade exceptions. I only have them. They have a few, but the only one that really is like sizable enough to matter is they have $4 million from the Wood trade, and that doesn't expire until June 24th, 2023. Their best spending tool projects as the non-taxpayer MLE. There are ways that this team could technically open up cap space, but I don't know why you would want to. It just, to jump through so many hoops, I'd rather just have that $10 million spending tool, $10+ million spending tool. And what do you have for just their biggest needs and priorities or questions? And I think we're both asking the same thing, in the sense that after their draft, which I thought they had, I know everyone had Paolo Banchero going to them at first. I think Jabari Smith is actually the better fit for their roster because of what he's like, his switchability on defense. It should just slide better next to Şengün. But they have Ty Washington. They got Terry Eason. They have 19 players under guaranteed contract if you just assume Jae'Sean Tate is going to be there. And so I think we're both sort of wondering, like, okay, well, where are they shedding some bodies?
Yeah, right. They're a little like OKC that way. I think they had 19 or potentially 19.
They might have had 50.
Yeah. They're all on weird second round partial guarantee. No, I think so. They're obviously, the Rockets are a full on rebuilder, but they're also over the cap. And so, like, in this situation, sometimes you'd say, well, like, this is let's make some moves and take on some bad money multi-year. Like, you could shift things around. You might have more flexibility after Wall is bought out, but like, they might have 70 million in room next offseason. And I don't think you want to mess around with that by taking on, like a Tobias Harris, or we're getting way out in the weeds, but like, so their options are even more limited in that regard, because it's not a place where you're going to, accumulate draft assets for somebody's bad money. It's certainly not bad multi-year money. I think, again, like, because they have so many roster spots filled, free agency is kind of not their main, focus. They still have to think about how they're going to, move Eric Gordon on at some point, even though I think I've read recently that, they value his leadership and all that stuff, but like, they probably
saw that they got a bottom 5 first for Christian Wood, and we're like, well, what are we going to get for 30-something Eric Gordon?
Yeah, suddenly. But do you think that Eric Gordon, I think Eric Gordon should get more than Christian Wood did, just because he fits in more places. Like, Christian Wood, I don't know, Dallas, that made a lot of sense, but Christian Wood's not exactly like a plug and play on a contender type of player, where Gordon, I think, maybe is.
Because I think he's better on defense even at his age, and there's just the downhill juice he provides in addition to the shooting. It's a more, like, he's a bigger commodity. That being said, like, the injury history, even though he was healthy this year, is not great. And I honestly don't know how teams are going to view that second, like the last year of his deal, which is non-guaranteed unless he makes an all-star game or they win the championship. In theory, if you win the championship, you won't care. There are teams that will care. # Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, no, I think so. For their free agency, like, I'm just skewing young, assuming they're going to go after anybody, but it's like, you look, kind of another second draft type of team. So your Lonnie Walkers, your Jalen Smith, your Bombas, your guy Coffee from the Clippers, I think, is someone that
Yeah, buddy.
you might look at. But yeah, it's not like you look at this team, it's like, well, what do they need? Because that's just not going to come via free agency. It's going to come as, Jalen Green and Sengun and now I can't think of Jabari Smith. Yeah, the guy who was supposed to go number 1 the entire draft until he didn't. See how that sort of fits together, and then maybe you make some moves at the deadline. That's maybe when Gordon goes. But yeah, free agency, I just would love to like paint this as a more interesting free agency team, but I'm not sure I see it.
They're a more interesting trade team, but for just to throw out for the sake of names and free agency, I thought along the lines of second draft as well. Very quickly though, they have Ty Washington, but would you consider, I know I didn't count him among their key free agents, but would you consider bringing back Dennis Schroeder?
I feel like Schroeder I think Schroeder's getting into that area where it's like, I just don't want him on my team, because there's been enough teams that have basically decided that, like, especially ones that are concerned about winning, that like, I don't know. I feel like we sort of know now. So especially if it's a young team where maybe you don't want, and you have some guys like Kevin Porter Jr. that like maybe their professionalism has been in question at points in their careers. Like, I'm not sure you want like a get mine Dennis Schroeder as like a tone setter, but like someone like that, like on court wise, just to sort of be a playmaker and provide a little offense. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I just don't know if he's the guy.
If they're going to have this, but no, if I'm going to, I'd rather just play Ty Washington, Josh Christopher, Kevin Porter Jr., the like Jalen Green, all that ball handling responsibility. I will say, if it's someone like a veteran who is either going there because you're like sort of what Daniel Tice did last season, like if DeLon Wright can't get the mid-level exception somewhere else, but Houston is offering the full non-taxpayer, I might consider that just to have like someone with more experience. I don't know, like on the lower end though, who's actually worth maybe then cutting into minutes of some of your younger guys. So, like you're not, I'm like going through the list of free agent point guards. Like if Eric Bledsoe gets waived, like that's not someone you're going to look at. Even Raul Neto, I don't think gives you like enough like mentorship there. Rondo, no. So like if DeLon Wright, if that was an option, I might consider it. Or even Tyus Jones, if he can't get the mid MLE money, he's only 26. So you can consider that. I had more so just, I'll list off like they're more sort of like wings, because that's what this team still feels like it needs. Maybe they're a PJ Dozier team. He's coming off that injury, as my voice just cracks there. I don't think they have the touches for him, but just like I want to see him go on a team and play. Kevin Knox, just as sort of a third draft guy at this point. What was the other name that stood out to me the most? I don't know why it's not. I had a third one that wasn't.
Jordan Nwora would make some sense if Milwaukee doesn't have the stomach to match on something, more than the minimum.
Oh, that would be a good one too. I didn't even think of that. But like those are the types of names you already mentioned. Like, oh, Jared Culver. I was like, let's just see Jared Culver. Maybe. Why not? And look, that might be even too rich in the sense that look at all the players they have on this roster. So I have the two questions here to wrap this up is, do you think Jae'Sean Tate and or Kevin Porter Jr. get an extension from this team?
I would extend Tate for sure, if only because I hate to like frame everything for the Rockets in this context, but like that's going to be a valuable player that teams are going to want. If you're looking to get some draft assets later, like Tate is he a Josh Richardson special candidate in terms of like the upper end of what they can do for him? I'd hate to put you on the spot, but if you're giving him 10 million plus a year, I think he'd be a value at that contract just because of the defense and maybe you can work out, a little more of an offensive repertoire for him. But I'd be more hesitant on Porter just because I'm not convinced that I'm certainly not convinced he's a point guard.
Right.
I'm also not convinced that he makes a ton of sense next to Green. And I think you do need to start thinking in terms of like, who's the optimal Jalen Green, like running mate in the backcourt.
For sure.
So I'd make Porter prove it, but Tate, I think I would be interested in keeping around on an extension.
Yeah, and like now that you have Ty Washington there, in addition to Jalen Green, maybe there's not as much of an urgency to extend Kevin Porter Jr. I don't even know, and Rockets fans have some Rockets fans have disagreed with. I'm with you, and I don't think he's like the lead guard. If you want him as a microwave scorer, either in the starting lineup, off the bench, that's the shot creation, the pressure he puts on defense, absolutely huge. Secondary playmaking, fine. I don't know what number I'd be comfortable extending him at, though. Like, I think I would probably land at, if he would sign for between 10 and 12, I might consider it. That does give you a mid-end contract to trade later if you want to. And like you said, they do have cap space next summer. I don't know how valuable that is at this particular stage of their development. And they're also, they got some Brooklyn Nets picks coming down the pipeline that might be pretty flashy as well. So they have to consider that moving forward. The other issue, so you think Eric Gordon, is he on the team to start next season?
I think probably, because if he was going to go anywhere, I think the draft would have been the time to do it. But I would say I don't think he'll be on the team through the deadline. If you're saying next season, like 23, 24.
No, I meant like to start, and then to follow it up. So you think he'll start there, but won't finish the season?
Yeah, because I think if he was going to go this offseason, he would have gone. I imagine all the conversations that they had around Wood were happening in parallel with conversations about trying to move Gordon, and just it didn't happen. So I think they have to move him at some point. Like maybe you get the benefit of him as a leader and like, a guy setting an example for the first half of this year. And then you decide we have to do this at some point in terms of like where we are as a rebuilding team.
And it's like, I'm almost just wondering, like, who are their trade candidates then if you think he's going to be there? I assume he's just going to be gone because I'm looking at, John Wall that's going to end in a buyout. Like, unless there's like a trade out there, like, that's going to end in a buyout. And then whoever they acquire for John Wall is probably going to be bought out if they do move him. But like, looking at this free agency class, it feels like teams will give up something for Eric Gordon, even if it's not more than what they got for Christian Wood, because what are their alternatives? And you sort of hinted at one that I'd given some thought to, is like, if Philly's trying to cut, because there's the rumor that Philly is the favorite to sign PJ Tucker, which it can't be unless it has access to the full mid-level exception, which is incredibly difficult for them after making the Melton trade, unless James Harden is either taking like sub $37 million a year, which would be like a $10 million pay cut, or are they flipping Tobias Harris for a smaller amount of salary? And that could be a way of consolidation where are you giving up Eric Gordon and another salary for Tobias Harris, and the Sixers are also compensating you in something, draft equity, whatever, to take on that last year. It feels like something along those lines is going to happen just because they have so many. And look, there are players that they don't need to have. They have, Trey Burke is on their books next season. So like they could just waive some of these guys and not care because they could trade Sterling Brown somewhere or just waive him. But I kind of just feel like, given the relative shallowness of this year's free agency class, we're going to see Eric Gordon moved because teams are going to need to take to the trade market to get upgrades.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, they got those 4 guys that came over in the Wood trade that are all on expirings between like $3 and $5 million. So, or less than that. Marquise Chris only makes 2.2. So they got all that, either they're getting waived, bought out, or
and they could just do it's small enough to where you sandwich them all together and it's like, oh, we have $8 million or $10 million in dead money from 1 year. That's not going to matter as much to the Rockets.
Yeah, right.
Our next team, the Memphis Grizzlies, who their summer could be, if they want it to be, pretty incredibly interesting. Their key free agents are Kyle Anderson, Tyus Jones, and Jarrett Culver. John Conchar, is the other non-guarantee. He has like a third of his salary guaranteed until July 3rd. I expect they might just guarantee that then. Notable extension candidates, they have a few. John Morant, I assume that he'll just sign a max extension with them. Dylan Brooks, Steven Adams, and Brandon Clark are more interesting extension candidates just because there's less of a defined market for them. They have a notable trade exception from the Grayson Allen deal, $4.1 million, that expires on July 7th of this year. And their best spending tool, I'm just assuming they'll keep the salary cap holds for Kyle Anderson and Tyus Jones, which would mean they're a non-taxpayer mid-level team. If they want to have cap space, though, they could. I just don't know what they would intend to do with that. And so what are you looking for or thinking about most for the Grizzlies heading into free agency?
Yeah, I think initially, and maybe still now, there was some question of how they would sort of choose to operate, whether they'd clear space or they'd operate as an over-the-cap team and potentially bring back their 2 main free agents that you mentioned. I think it's more likely that maybe Jones comes back and maybe that's feasible. But I think just sort of based on how, the guys they added in the draft, Laravian and Roddy, and I think Zaire Williams is a guy that's most likely going to improve.
Love with him. I was not a fan of the pick, and now I'm in love with him.
He played significant minutes for a really good team, and they trusted him to guard. You wouldn't they have plenty of great options for top scorers, but Williams wasn't someone they necessarily hit all the time. So with those 3, I think Kyle Anderson's time is probably done. So Yeah, I just their options are big. I mean, they're a trade team too because I don't imagine they're going to extend anyone for sure other than Ja. Like I think Brooks and Steven Adams and throw Green in there, I guess, depending on what happens with him and his and his guarantee. But like they have salary to mush together in a trade. They've got I think they have all their picks plus a Warriors 2024 first
Yep.
coming. So they still are a team with just like a ton of power to like just do what they want. I mean, we could just get into it now. Like, Kevin, if you're looking for teams that can put together a Kevin Durant package, I don't know. The Grizzlies are right there, and like they've got all the picks, they've got salary, and not totally dead salary. Like Adams and Brooks are starters, on a good team. So yeah, they've got a lot of flexibility. It just depends on how they want to operate. And what they want to do with Tyus Jones, like how big of a priority he is to bring back. I think they can get him at a decent number just because I think the teams that want point guards are going to like go bigger on Brunson and you maybe are going to trade for Brogdon or D'Angelo Russell or something before you get down to let's talk about signing Tyus Jones.
Yeah, I guess he could be a backup plan for like the Knicks or if the Mavericks have the non-taxpayer MLE. That feels like I don't want to say his ceiling, but that feels like where he'll land, that $10 million a year. And I might look, I know you're about to pay Jai. I'd still just keep him around because if you need to move him but you already you traded D'Anthony Melton, not that he was necessarily the purest point guard anyway. I do think now, for all the reasons you laid out, I'm not really adding anything to the discussion at this point. And also, keeping Tyus Jones limits the amount of time that Dillon Brooks has to have the ball in his hands, which is some nights that's too much of an adventure. Would you, for the Kevin Durant stuff, and I don't want this to define, the lowbrow fruit, but if they're the Grizzlies and Kevin Durant has 4 years left on his deal and he wants to come to Memphis, one, I think you absolutely go after him because you're so good now. My question is, where is the line? You're not moving Ja. Brooklyn comes to you though and wants Jaren Jackson Jr. What are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, and if you're the Nets, that's got to be where it starts. Like you have to start negotiating there.
My gut is the Grizzlies say no. Like it's not even a discussion.
I'm first saying like, how about you can control our draft? So Brooklyn, you have a draft back now because you don't have one basically, and you can have whatever you want through alternate swaps and just full on rights to these picks through like however far we can go, 27, 28, like whatever, take it all. Because if we have John, we have Durant, and we have a decent supporting cast, like those picks are going to be in the 20s anyway.
I also think, and I'm not sure that I would do this. I think this is where it comes back to, are we romanticizing prospects or younger players? The fact that they have Desmond Bane and Zaire Williams, it feels like if Brooklyn is actually rebuilding, if they're moving Kevin Durant, which they will be, there are packages that can be built by Memphis specifically without including either of their two most important blue chip cornerstones, which is Triple J and John Morant.
Yeah. I mean, there's some argument to be made that, like, do you want to mess with this? I mean, I know it's like blasphemous because we're talking about Kevin Durant, but like, age-wise, decline-wise, like, I mean, Kevin Durant's best years are behind him, right? Like at best, he's going to sustain and stay very, very good. Great. We thought he was the best player in the league for like a couple months there. So he still has that status, but the future's so bright and there's so many options and it's just not a small market move, generally speaking, to do this. It's like we're operating in reverse almost. Like this is usually the team that has Kevin Durant and has to trade him for 17 first rounders. It's still intriguing though. And it's just, the reality is the Grizzlies can do almost whatever they want. If you do the big thing, then all of your different avenues to succeed for the next 7-8 years kind of trim down to one. And if it also, just to throw it out there, like, if you're depending on Kevin Durant to not age and John Morant to not get hurt, you've really you're kind of a high wire act now, and it's kind of a boom or bust. But if they had Durant next year, like they're going to be at the top of the West anyway. I don't know who I'd pick over them for sure at that point.
Yeah, Memphis might be my favorite KD landing spot. Are there actual available players as of now that you've given thought to who Memphis should go after via trade or free agency?
Yeah, I think you kind of, again, assuming they're going to have the full MLE, which is a significant asset. Like I think you probably look at Otto Porter, and all that stuff I said about how maybe Kyle Anderson is expendable now because of the forwards in the pipeline. and the wings in the pipeline. I still think Porter makes sense. I don't know if I'm giving him the full MLE, but you can. I think Gary Payton is someone you could add to just make this defense like just
Wow.
unfair.
Wow. Yeah.
And like, I do think Brooks is someone they should be looking hard to trade. And so if you want to do that, and you've lost Melton too. So I think if you want to move Brooks, you probably want to have another defensive like shutdown option. Peyton is smaller, but he plays as big as Brooks a lot of the time. So, of the non-Warriors division, I think if you just want to ensure the Tyus Jones thing, you look at Neto. But other than that, like, Daylon Wright, again, just someone that makes sense as like a Melton replacement, sort of. But yeah, other than that, I think they're more of a trade team, and I'd be looking at what I could get for Adams, Brooks, and what that kind of thing.
I wonder also if they should be looking at another type of 4-5, just especially if you're letting Kyle Anderson walk and he played a ton of time at the 4. You have Brandon Clark, Steven Adams, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Xavier Tillman, and now David Roddy, of course. And we can't forget Santi Aldama. But like, is it just something that you would maybe want to, someone who can play with either Steven Adams or Jaren Jackson Jr., like a Chris Boucher, who I will mention for every single team because he's amazing, or even Mo Bamba could be good for this team, or even Hartenstein. I think that, maybe that makes more sense if you're eventually going to get rid of Steven Adams, if you're not extending him and you're letting him walk, because those two you don't want to see play with Steven Adams, which is why I gravitated towards Chris Boucher. You could also go the Otto Porter Jr. route, but I was trying to think of like someone who might be able to log a little bit of time at the 5 as well. So I'd be curious if they could go that route. I also wondered are they going to, because you mentioned sort of a priority should be to move Dillon Brooks, is their focus going to be more on trades this offseason, knowing that they have to make some decisions soon on a Steven Adams, on a Dillon Brooks, even Brandon Clark? And then what type of swing are you making in that situation? Because it could be something like, you could probably get Eric Gordon for, if Danny Green, let's just say you guarantee his salary, include another smaller salary, and then there's a sweetener. And Eric Gordon would make a lot of sense on this team, especially if you might move Dillon Brooks in another trade. I have wondered if, and he hasn't been mentioned, and Grizzlies fans were totally against my idea for them to trade a Miles Turner at last year's deadline, which is fine. Does John Collins make sense for this team? If you're not giving up any of your 3 best assets, which is Morant, Jackson, and Bane, does he make sense alongside Jaren Jackson Jr. long term, or no?
Long term, it's tough. I think, the ideal version of Jaren Jackson is he's a full-time center at some point, right? And he's going to provide you all the spacing and shot blocking, and you don't necessarily need more heft in there. I do think the playoff run kind of showed that the Grizzlies are really good when they have 2 bigs in there, and one of them's Jackson. Collins is such a weird fit. Almost just be like which is crazy to say because he can do so much. But I don't know if a Jackson Collins front line has enough like punch, is like big enough, physical enough. But you'd upgrade your skill level just immensely. And you could have some crazy 5-out looks too with that. And you'd be long, but I don't know if you're quite like, which is like, it's 2022 and we're talking like, are they big enough? Are they physical enough? But that's kind of my reservation.
Yeah. And I think if you were going to go that route, you probably want someone who's going to be more of his own shot creator, because even I like John Collins' floor game, but the Grizzlies feel like they still need, is it Zaire Williams long-term? Is it Desmond Bane based off what he did this season? You have Jaren Jackson Jr. Still feels like they could use some insurance there, which is why Eric Gordon as a stopgap would be pretty interesting. It would have to be a trade because he has a team option that the Pacers are actually absolutely picking up. I would love O'Shea Brissett for Memphis, someone that they could, because of the way that they're set up at every position, but not set up at every position. Just someone you could toggle between basically everywhere at this point might be like, and it feels like a Grizzlies move. It's a guy that maybe wouldn't cost a ton. He's certainly not making a ton. Is it a stopgap? Is it a long-term play? That could be someone that they look at. It's funny going through the free agency list though, because I feel like I'm not in love with anyone for them. Like I could see Lonnie Walker might be interesting here. Depending again on what you think the future is with, is Kyle Anderson coming back? What are you doing with Dillon Brooks? And I was actually going to ask you whether you see anyone other than Ja on this team getting an extension, because that would, if you extend Dillon Brooks, if you extend Steven Adams or Brandon Clark, that probably says a lot about how, or it informs a lot about how you're going to view free agency.
Yeah, I think one name that just popped up to me, if you're going to lose Kyle Anderson and you want to replace some of the facilitation, Thad Young, I think he's another guy I feel like I'm going to mention on every team just because you can get away. I think I actually feel better about a defensive front court with him and Jackson than I do Collins and Jackson. And he's a good, he's what he averaged like 5 assists a game or something ridiculous like that with the Bulls a couple of years ago. I don't know if you want him necessarily playing that big a role, but he can do it. I think extension wise, it's just Ja for me because you can make the opposite case, but I think a guy like Brooks and Adams, some of the appeal or some of the value in them might be tied up in them being expiring. That's changed a little bit lately. I feel like the idea of the expiring contract doesn't return quite the same amount of
Right.
You don't get a haul for that anymore. But I would feel uncomfortable committing what it would take to Brooks just because that's a fairly large salary slot that may not be a positive asset if it goes out 3 or 4 years versus it's expiring. Oh, we're a contender. We need a 3 and we need a lower little 3 and D wing that can just toughen us. Like he makes sense as like a rental to me. Maybe that undersells him, but
Lowercase 3, uppercase D.
Exactly. That's it.
I would just be worried about him specifically hitting free agency. And then if he gets the $18 million a year offer from some team, if you get him at the number that he's really coming off of, where it's between 12 and like 14 million, I would consider it for Dylan Brooks would probably be the only other player I'd look at.
Yeah, you don't extend Adams, right? There's like, that's just...
My thought was like, if you can get him at a really cheap number and then it's someone that is just there and you could also move later on, but the big man market for what it will be for him, you could view it that way in free agency as well.
Exactly. Right.
On to the New Orleans Pelicans. Get excited. Their key free agent is Tony Snell. Notable non-guarantees include Jose Alvarado. He will be back. Do not worry. Notable extension candidates on this team: Larry Nance Jr., CJ McCollum, Jackson Hayes, and that guy, Zion Williamson. They have one notable trade exception. That's the Steven Adams $6.4 million one. It expires on July 7th, 2022. Their best spending tool, I have it as the mini MLE because I have them inside $10 million of the apron right now. They could, I don't know if they're going to want to pay the tax, one, let alone the apron. And two, if they wanted to dump salary, maybe it's with Jackson Hayes or through a Devontae Graham trade and open up the bigger MLE, they could. I don't know if this is the market to try, and do that in. But I have them as a mini MLE spending team. I think it starts here. This one's the easier one. What are you doing with Zion Williamson's extension?
I didn't think hard enough about this one. I think
I'm offering it. Look, you give him the max.
Do you?
Yes. And if you could include this sort of Joel Embiid type safeguards, if he's not willing to do that at all, that's where it gets a little interesting.
Right. That's where you start, though. There's no scenario where you don't start with, let's talk about an Embiid-esque rookie extension, right? Like it can't be a no questions asked extension. Right. Like, I think honestly, then if that's just a hard line, I might DeAndre Ayton this and be like, we'll just talk about this in a year. Like, sorry, you just
run the risk then of, and I don't think Ayton would have this kind of leverage after he had a really good season. Zion would. He could just go sign like a 2+1, 3+1 somewhere. And then you don't, like, he won't even deal with you. Like, you're just going to have to match that offer sheet. Zion Williamson said he would come out and sign with the Pelicans long term. And if push came to shove and he wasn't willing to include any safeguards in the deal, I might give it to him anyway. Just his talent at full strength. Like, just remember him last season was probably one of the 15 to 17 best players in the league.
You're not wrong. I guess this is just me being risk averse. Like, I think there are still like no argument in terms of the impact that he made in the like blink of an eye that he was healthy. It felt like really potentially great. I still have questions about like what kind of roster do you fit around him? I have made like, I just don't see a scenario where we go the next 10 years and don't have more than one season where injuries are a major factor. Like even in the next 5, which is what you're talking about with an extension that he's eligible for. So I guess I'm more comfortable. And like, of course he said he'll take the full, of course he'll take the full max if they offer it, like, because then I can demand a trade anyway. That's just how the league works. It's fine. I have more reservations. I don't think I'm willing to do that. I would draw a harder line, just knowing that worst, push comes to shove, he's the last guy in the world that's going to take the qualifying offer and just, gamble that way. There's no scenario. I don't think that's realistic.
Are you sure?
I just don't think, based on his injury history, anyone advising him could possibly say this is a good idea. I just he's got to get, he seems like someone that, and not personally, but just the situation he's in, you need to lock down as much guaranteed money as you can. And so the idea of that level of risk, now maybe that changes if he has a phenomenal, he doesn't get an extension and he has a phenomenal season. And suddenly it's well, it's a no, he has all the leverage in the world. That's the downside risk of doing an Ayton in this situation.
I think he ultimately just has more leverage than New Orleans, because I think he is that anomalous, that transcendent. And it's not a shot against the Pelicans. I wouldn't let that player, as long as I can have him here and be under team control. Maybe he doesn't have a player option in year 5. And I ultimately think it's going to end up with, he signs a 5-year max. I don't know what's going to happen with the player option. My guess is it's either really heavily safeguarded, the entire contract for the Pelicans, or maybe there are lighter non-guarantees in his favor, and he gives up his player option in the 5th year. That being said, it also could be, if they're both sort of on the same page, he does have the leverage to where, even if he has a bad year next season, someone would offer him the max in restricted free agency. Could he roll the dice, want to stay in New Orleans, have a good year, and then he just gets the 5-year max from New Orleans free and clear, where there aren't going to be any injury safeguards in there for them, because he's coming off of, let's say, a 67 game campaign, only missed 10 or 15 games.
Yeah. I think I may be anchoring too much, because when it was real bad, when it was just injury after injury and all this time off, I kind of developed the opinion that Zion is a player who's great mainly, almost entirely, because of just ridiculous athleticism, right? He's not
I don't know, some of the passes he threw,
right. But he has to get into space to be able to throw those passes. So I think I'm not going to say entirely, but very largely based on athleticism. And just I think it's fair to say that since Duke, he's become less athletic. So just, the injuries are taking a toll in that regard. And the trajectory, I would expect, unless we see, best shape of his life stuff in summer league, not in summer league, but during that time where it's the weight is way down, and he looks incredible. He looks like Duke Zion. Then I might change my opinion, but I'm just kind of pessimistic on his long-term health outlook and how well he's going to age as the athleticism declines. Because when that's not elite anymore, it's not like he's a knockdown shooter, except for his debut when he made 4 threes and everybody lost their minds. There are a lot of questions. If he's not getting off the floor and can't move with burst, I don't know. I would love it if he proved me wrong. I would love it. I have a lot of reservations about it.
Moral of the story, though, this was very first takey of us, but Zion Williamson will be in New Orleans next season.
Yes.
That being said, the last first take element of this preview, Brooklyn comes along, offers Kevin Durant, wants Zion Williamson back in a package. What are you doing if you're New Orleans?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. What did I say before we started recording when you asked me that? I think I said I would do it.
I said I wouldn't, because it's just, if Kevin Durant really wants to be in New Orleans, I guess anything has to be for a discussion. But what else? If it's Zion plus salary, I guess you consider it. But we can't pretend that Kevin Durant has just been Mr. Durability over the past 3 years.
Right. Yeah.
So I ultimately wouldn't, but they are a team that I think could build subsequent packages where, if New Orleans is if Brooklyn's going around asking for all of these, we want Scotty Barnes from Toronto, if that's a no, doing those types of things. If you circle back and they miss on all those initial marks, New Orleans is among the teams that could build non-Zion trade packages that would make a ton of sense. What do you view as the roster's biggest needs now, though, heading into free agency?
Well, they don't have a lot, because their roster is basically set.
They look really, really good if you pencil in a healthy Zion.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think they are potential major high riser. You saw flashes of what McCollum kind of did to transform how they operated. I think so. Having said that, I think I'd like one more versatile defensive piece. just because Herb Jones, as great as he is, I think you're going to need some lineups where,
Dyson
Brandon
Daniels.
Ingram, what's that?
Dyson Daniels is on this roster. They might already
That's
have
true. That is kind of what he does, everything but shoot, basically, right? I think I'd like one more, wing switchy defensive piece. I think I'd like maybe I think that your best looks are going to be Zion at the 5. If you're really trying to maximize what this team can be, but I'd
Zion, like Zion Nance type, where Nance might be your defensive 5. Yeah.
Yeah, like Miles Turner would. This isn't a free agent thing, but someone like that has always made a lot of sense there for me.
Pelicans fans already tuned us out.
They don't like it.
They're in love with Valanciunas, who was really good, and they don't view Turner as enough of an upgrade. I think defensively, he would be a massive upgrade. I also don't know. I don't know their path to getting Miles Turner anymore. Like, if you're Indiana, do you want Jonas Valanciunas? Like, wow. And then if you're the Pelicans, do you want Zion and Jonas Valanciunas and oh my God, why can't and Miles Turner on your roster? Like, that doesn't make a ton of sense.
No, I think so. Just in terms of like their what do you see their needs as? Do you see them as different than, or needs, quote unquote? But
I think so. I would prefer them to prioritize. I don't want to say a point guard, because you have CJ McCollum, Zion, Brandon Ingram, and Devontae Graham is not just like, he doesn't suck now. His shooting has fallen off. But I would like to see them get an upgrade in what Devontae Graham's supposed to be. So is that Devontae Graham getting better? Is it, we're giving Kyra Lewis Jr. a really extensive look this year? I don't view the wing depth as big of an issue, I guess, because I really, Dyson Daniels is like my second favorite prospect in the draft. And then also what Trey Murphy was able to do during the tail end of last year in the regular season and the playoffs. But I do think it would be smart to sort of hedge against that. So I would be that's my second priority. But if you could also just get shooting on this roster, because that's going to be the best, especially with Jonas Valanciunas can shoot the ball well, but if he and Zion is going to be a lineup you tinker with, the volume is not high for Valanciunas. It's the same with Larry Nance Jr. Like, I like the Larry Nance Jr. Zion Williamson look a lot better on defense, clearly, but Larry Nance Jr. is not someone who chucks up threes in absurd volume. So can you find someone who might be willing to do that? My single favorite free agent target for them, who I don't know if they can afford, Gary Payton II, because there brings that defensive element to where, look, him and Herb Jones could just like swap assignments. Like, that's how Herb Jones covers the positional spectrum. Gary Payton II guards up a ton as well. He shot the 3 ball well enough last year with Golden State to where you can envision if you get him those open looks, he will hit them. And he's good at moving off the ball, or if they want to use him to set screens, if they get that creative with him. He's my favorite. And then he's also just like, okay, if Devontae Graham goes bust, or we want to get rid of Devontae Graham, like, at least we have another point guard on the roster. But that was my thing, is you don't really need that point guard because you have Zion, Brandon Ingram, and CJ. Like, those are your primary playmakers. That's all you need.
No, I think that Peyton makes sense in a very specific and I would add Bruce Brown too, because they're, insofar as those players are similar to anyone, they're similar to each other. If you have essentially a power forward in Zion who's going to play a lot of point guard, you might as well have a point guard who's going to play a lot of power forward, basically, which is what kind of how Peyton and Brown operate. Peyton proved himself to be a pretty good corner 3-point shooter, which is like, that's fantastic. If you could do that for this Pelicans team and just, at least have someone run at you once in a while, all the other stuff he brings will be, very welcome. Brown's kind of the same way. I'm oddly like more skeptical about Brown being like sustaining some of his shooting from this past season, but yeah,
I think for some reason, I don't know what is just like, something just felt, I think his was too much of an outlier, where it's Gary Payton II was like 36% on catch and shoots. It's like, okay. But like, I think Bruce Brown was like closer to 40 on those. It's like, that came a little bit out of nowhere.
A little much for me. I think backing up a little bit to kind of hit these targets in full. Like, I do think they can duck the tax, and I think they could be in position to have the full mid level. I mean, they've got so many guys on low numbers that they could finagle a little bit. And then if you have the full mid level, that opens you up to going after, TJ Warren, I think, is just another big wing size body that could work combo forward. It seems like PJ Tucker is only interested in like,
Philly or Miami.
Go back to Miami.
PJ Tucker would be just like,
it'd be perfect.
The PJ Tucker type would be like which I'm sure every team wants a PJ Tucker.
Right. That's the thing.
That's my insight. Every team should get more players like PJ Tucker to round out their rotation.
Yeah. No, so I think if they get to the full MLE, then they really get pretty interesting, because the names are pretty solid at that level.
I thought, and again, this sort of deviates from, I think their biggest need is shooting. just in general, like they could be a sneaky Victor Oladipo team in that case. Like maybe you're just really out on Devontae Graham and you want to go completely point guardless type deal. And he's not going to torpedo your defense. He had some good moments in Miami during the playoffs. I also thought on the smaller end, but because you have Trey Murphy III, Dyson Daniels, and Herb Jones, Gary Harris here might make a lot of sense. So those are names. And look, we're obligated to mention, I wouldn't spend the MLE on him. Like Chris Boucher would totally work here.
Yep. Yeah. He's like anywhere you're thinking about Miles Turner and you're willing to take a downgrade, Boucher's the fit. Kind of simple.
We're also probably contractually obligated to mention Amir Coffey, who also would be a pretty good fit here as well. Mm-hmm. He's a pretty good fit for everything. Our final squad in the Southwest is the San Antonio Spurs. Their key free agents are really only Lonnie Walker IV. He is restricted. Notable non-guarantees. Zach Collins, half of his money became guaranteed after the draft, so I imagine they'll just guarantee that $7.6 million. Keita Bates-Diop, Trey Jones, and Jock Landale are all non-guaranteed at sub $2 million. Non-guaranteed at sub $2 million. I would expect probably the vast, maybe not Keita Bates-Diop to be back, but I would expect the other two to be back. And they have DeJounte Murray, Jakob Poeltl, Trey Jones, and Romeo Langford, is their most notable extension candidates. They don't have any big trade exceptions. Their best spending tool, I have them between $25 and $30 million in cap space, depending on how things shake out. They can get to max room for a player who's whatever experience level they want. Oh, between 0 and let's say 7 years. Once you get to the 10 range, that's $42.7 million. That would take more of a hurdle, but they can get max room if they want. What are you looking for? What are you thinking about for the Spurs as we head into free agency?
Well, I mean, so they're still mostly a young team and they have, some flexibility. They can clear enough room. I think from my perspective, you start with Ayton and Bridges because you're just one of these few teams with cap space and you kind of work down from there, which is hard to do because you're going to tie up stuff in an offer sheet. So you better know before you do it, which I think everybody realistically does, generally speaking.
But if there's a team that doesn't care about tying up their cap space, it's going to be the Spurs.
That's true.
And they also did, I think what helps them too is they added 3 rookies, none of which are bigs, but depending on how you feel about Jeremy Sohan, and then Blake Wesley and Malachi Branham. I'm just like, they're a team that I could just see like, yeah, we'll give near max or the max to DeAndre or Miles Bridges. And if you match, whatever, like who are we going to sign anyway?
Right. Exactly. And so I think they feel like a pretty good. I don't think they're like Jakob Poeltl is a good center. I think he's not,
extend him?
Well, I need to know
here's the bigger question. Would he accept an extension?
I mean, it's still not a non-superstar centers league. I think any center that gets a reasonable extension offer should probably just take it, unless you have like, I'm going to be an all-star and I'm going to bet on myself.
Starting at $11.3 million, I think is about his max.
Does that feel about right to you?
It feels right. If I'm him, people now know that he's like one of the best rim protectors in the league. I might roll the dice into free agency because that's about where the mid-level exception might wind up anyway, as of now.
That's true. No, I think the Spurs feel like a logical Ayton spot to me. Now maybe
I think it's pretty clear based on the reporting, and then just I don't know, noise I've heard from people who are actually plugged in and like report this stuff. It very much feels like DeAndre Ayton is trying to push his way to San Antonio to me. I don't know if the interest is mutual. Like they could use him. I just don't know. And the thing that's sort of hanging over all this, I do believe that the DeJounte Murray trade rumors are driven more so by teams interested in DeJounte Murray. Atlanta than the Spurs. Especially because like the John Collins framework, if there was a third team involved and San Antonio was getting showered in draft equity, okay. But otherwise it feels like a very lateral move to where I think Collins could diversify your offense if you think Primo or you even think like Branham can make an immediate offensive impact, that Vassell is ready for more on-ball responsibility. But like it's a lateral or getting worse move that doesn't set you up better for the long term.
I think Murray is like orders of magnitude more valuable than John Collins.
I'm with you. And he's not going to sign an extension, which I think is also why people are talking about this, because the max they can offer him, like this is a guy who's going to get near max or max money when he actually hits free agency at this rate, unless anything happens. And he's scheduled to hit free agency in 2 years in 2024. So I mean, I would offer the extension, but just 120% off his number doesn't get you to what his max would be.
No chance he takes that, and he shouldn't take it. I think the arrow is still up on a guy that just went like 21, 9, and 8 and is improving in like all the ways you want and is a great defensive guard.
I will say that gets me to what I think this team's they have two needs that stand out. Like they could use another front court somebody, whether you think it's someone who needs to play the 4 or 5 or a straight up 5 behind Jakob Poeltl. But I also am like, they need, and maybe he's already on the roster, they need like the second ball handling shot maker, even the primary off the dribble scorer, I would say, because it's not, Murray's not like, he's developed a mid-range game, gives you some just finishing around the rim. He's good enough to hit, like, if you need him to slow dribble into threes or hit spot up threes, like that's something he can do. But they need, like, that's why when Murray tweeted and deleted the picture of Zach LaVine in the Spurs jersey, that's the type of guy. Unless you believe that guy is on the roster, I mean, he's the type of guy for any team, but unless you believe that type of somebody's on the roster, that's who you need. I do think it puts them in an interesting pickle in the sense that how do you find that guy based off where they are going to be drafting with this roster? Because they're too good to tank. As like, you can't, unless you're going to trade Murray, you can't move anyone else on this roster and tell me that the Spurs get appreciably worse. I'm not saying he is their nerve center, but it's just like everyone else, the drop off to me between their best player and their second best player is probably one of the largest in the league right now, depending on how you feel about Keldon Johnson, or I'm in love with Devin Vassell. At the same time, it's like, why would you tank? Because Murray's like younger on this great contract, still so good. So how do you go about acquiring this player? Maybe you do trust your draft. Like, oh, we found him in Jeremy Sohan, or we found him in Branham, who a lot of people had like really going up towards the lottery. I'm more of a skeptic in how his shot making is going to, I don't know if anyone could see me using my hand but so unless you really trust your draft, which I imagine the Spurs do, dude, are they sort of just like, if someone, everyone's like, oh, they need to sell off DeJounte Murray. What if they decide, whoa, we have cap space, we have trade assets, like we're going the other way. I don't know if Ayton or Miles Bridges is that guy. I would love to see Miles Bridges on this team, if only because the Spurs, after being like the bastion of conventionality for so long, now just have all of a sudden like these like wings and forwards, like positionless, Keldon Johnson, Miles Bridges, Devin Vassell, and like that, they're running out that as a front court at one point. That was my long rambling way of saying the Spurs' direction feels so undefined. And normally I might crucify teams for that. With them, I'm like, I just view it as flexibility, as malleability.
I agree. I do think there have been some signs recently, like they made a deadline trade. Like, so I think there are signs that they're going to operate sort of more conventionally as opposed to the last 20-ish years where it was kind of, we'll just draft and we'll develop, and that's just kind of how we're going to do it. I do think they'll wait till Popovich is gone to like really just become a quote unquote normal team in terms of how they build. But yeah, LaVine is the guy. Like, we should have just mentioned him up front. It just doesn't seem realistic because Chicago can do the 5th year and just, more money and all that stuff. But I don't know, man. Like, I would be thinking about, not that there are LaVine types per se, but like if we're talking about restricted free agents to sort of like mess around with, like, I think Anthony Simons actually shares a lot of similarities
with him too.
LaVine, like a younger LaVine. You have the defensive questions. You have this like, oh shit, this guy is a lights out shooter all of a sudden. I mean, that's, probably disrespectful, but like great shooter, great athlete, like kind of similar. And you would use Murray to guard whoever you don't want Simons to guard. And that's just kind of how it would work there. So yeah, super flexible. I think I'm not trading Murray just at all. Like that all that noise needs to stop.
It would take even I think what was it framed as, a Drew Holiday type offer? It depends on the team that's making that offer, because if it's a team like the Bucks who can't make that offer but are projected to be that good, that doesn't do it for me if I'm San Antonio. Like, right. It needs to be like bowled over type deal, to where if it was the Hawks that went that route, or if it's the Knicks, where we'll bet against your next 3 to 4 first round picks. That's a bet that we're willing to make here.
I need a minimum of like 3 shots at getting someone who might be as good as Murray. Because chances are you're not going to hit on any of those, but I need a minimum of that. Like, so they got to be high value assets.
I'm not mad or even disappointed. Maybe I'm a little proud of you, or I'm this isn't creative. My take for this section was I would go, and I don't know if it's taking max money. I would pay Anthony Simons to see what the Blazers do, because I know they have Branham. I love Josh Primo. I like Trey Jones. You already know how I feel about Devin Vassell, but you can make it work. And I don't know that Trey Jones and Josh Primo and Malachi Branham, like you could have some of those guys. You could keep them there and it's fine. There's no one aside from Devin Vassell, and he can play up. Like he doesn't need to be your two. Simons and Murray works in the backcourt, and I like that better than. I think you could argue that Ayton or Bridges is just as good of a fit, but like Jakob Poeltl is fine. You have Keldon Johnson, who he's extension eligible as well. I would go the shot creation route, and that you're not getting that as much of it in Miles Bridges or Ayton. And I'd be curious if, I know the Blazers seem prepared to pay Simons, but if we haven't really talked about what we think his extension, or rather next contract, ends up being. Like, if you gave him $25 million, like, is that something that the Blazers wouldn't hesitate to match? And, if it, like, he's the one where it's like, okay, if the Suns let Ayton walk and get nothing in return, it's going to be max money. Simons is tougher because I feel like his sample size of impact is just a little bit more finite to this point. But like, if I'm the Spurs, I don't know, man. Like, I would do, this is probably why I'm not in charge of an NBA team. I'd be doing some pretty reckless things with the offer sheets right now.
Well, no, I agree. I two things. One is, I think Simons seems like it's fait accompli that the Blazers will keep him at a number that's like kind of scary. And that fit sucks. That fit's terrible. It's like him and Lillard are not a good fit. It's McCollum and Lillard with more question marks.
I will say what they've done is they've gotten younger, and then I think there's now more defense on the perimeter around them with Josh Hart, Jeremy Grant.
Sure. But the San Antonio fit is great. So whatever the number is for it to be a palatable signing for the Blazers, that number should be higher for the Spurs. So just a roundabout way of saying, like, the Spurs should probably be willing to offer more because it makes more sense. And all the flexibility and optionality you talked about, all these young guys, all their pick equity. If it's apparent after a year or two that the Simons thing, like, Simons turns out he's a good stats, bad team guy, we're overpaying for that like garbage stretch run on a Blazers team that was trying to lose, you still have all these other pieces to throw in to move him. You always have to be thinking, like, how difficult will it be to get off this? I don't think it'll be very hard if they need to, if it goes totally wrong. So Simons should be like that. To your point, the Spurs should get reckless because you need to push the Blazers to a decision, which they'll make. And then worst case, you've just tied up the Blazers.
Yeah. I was afraid to say it, but I'm like, his max is 30.5. I might just do it. The Blazers don't seem like they're not going to match anyway. Then maybe you're a little bit worried, but like, you have DeJounte Murray below market for the next 2 years.
Exactly.
There's flexibility there.
Yeah.
The last two phases of this part for the Spurs, do you think Keldon Johnson gets an extension?
I think he's a clutch guy, so no. I think he's going to wait and see if he can get 9 figures in restricted free agency or whatever his max would be. I don't see him extending. Like, I would try because he was the best corner 3-point shooter in the league last year.
The way he went from I think Nekias Duncan used to call him basically like a bull in a china shop, and I've called him like a bowling ball with legs. When you look at the way he played last year to where he felt more plug and play on offense, that makes him infinitely more valuable because it's like he doesn't need to have the ball in his hands. It isn't just this straight line guy. I would look at extending him because I get what you're saying, but I kind of feel like, I don't know, in the 15 to 18 range, like you're turning that down if you're him.
I think he would. I would offer it if I'm the Spurs for sure. Because I think there's still like a lot of, like, for as physical and strong as he is and as hard as he drives the ball, he still doesn't get to the line like nearly enough for his style of play. And so I think if you add that and the 3-point shooting, like, forget improves, just sustains, or it gets a little worse, like suddenly he's just like an efficiency monster and at the position you want, like it just, so he might be worth, 20-25 million a year down the line at some point. It's just, I wouldn't rule that out yet. I think he's on that track.
I wonder if you price that into why you wouldn't go and make an offer sheet to Ayton. Or first of all, if you're going to make an offer sheet to Bridges, the Bridges Keldon Johnson fit, if you end up paying both of those guys, is Bridges your center at that point? But I wonder if that proves prohibitive for the Spurs. I'm all in on Simons with them. who is most likely on this team to get an extension. I don't know why I left Keldon Johnson off the initial list. Maybe I was tired when I was writing this, but between Murray, Pirtle, and I think it's Keldon Johnson are like the real. I know Trey Jones, Romeo Langford. Who cares? Who do you think is most likely to sign an extension out of those three?
I just go Pirtle, even though I said I downplayed it, just because I think Murray has way too much to lose. He leaves a lot of money on the table, and I think Johnson probably does too if he extends now, based on like just the raise isn't big enough right now.
Based off what we outlined, whether it's another big, maybe some more established wing defenders, or just high volume shooting, whether that's off the dribble or even the catch at this point, any free agents that you particularly like for them?
Yeah, I think shooting, Murray makes it kind of easy because you can sort of throw more limited guys in there. I think you might see him bring back someone like Bryn Forbes, just like, let's just get the guy next to Murray that Murray can cover for and that he's going to space the floor. Gary Harris is someone else. I think Malik Monk, they have a lot of options. I don't know how much of their cap space they want to use, because like they're another team that if we get partway through the year and nobody has space and the Spurs kind of hang on to some of it, maybe that's your Tobias Harris dump. Maybe that's, whatever else you want to do. So, I mean, they could fit any kind of shooting backcourt player. I'd love to see a center with some stretch. That'd be cool. But
Shout out to Boucher.
Boucher for sure jumps in there. But yeah,
Mobamba, this could be a fun Mobamba team too.
I for sure. I think you have a lot of options. I do think one consideration to just kind of keep in the back of mind is that not using all this space might not be the worst thing, because I think most other teams probably will use this. The few that have it may end up using
and they have, like, if they keep some of it, they have a walking trade exception who is good for them, and Josh Richardson. I think it's become underrated at this point. I think my favorite free agent target for them, and it's sort of a hedge against what happens with Pirtle, would be Isaiah Hartenstein here. This feels like a place where he could really thrive. I don't know. I would pay, like, they could outbid other teams. I'm not getting into a bidding war for him, but you're even in a scenario where if Pirtle was going to sign an extension and you could get Hartenstein, you end up paying 23 to 25 million a year for both those guys. Like, that's a quality center rotation there, which is why I'm not as thrilled about the Ayton fit for them. And it would probably happen unless the Suns just suck. If it would happen via sign and trade, and it's, what are you giving up? It'd probably be Pirtle and Richardson to start. Is there anything else in there? Is Ayton make you a lot better than those two? I guess we have to see more of him independent of the Suns ecosystem, where he was used as more of an accessory than anything. And that might be, I don't mean to insult him, but like he was just more of a complimentary offensive player than a prominent like hub.
Right. I like Nick Claxton if you want to mess around with more restricted free agents. I think because, the Nets probably have a fairly low ceiling on where they're willing to go, depending on who knows how things shake out.
Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are gone. Look, we're reporting this as a new report came out. The Nets are willing to get rid of both Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. Just, this is not really the Spurs at all, but can we just, pure comedy. Like, you grow a backbone now after turning over your franchise to them in 2019, letting them run the coach out of town, letting them hire the next coach, signing DeAndre Jordan for them, having to undo that move, trading for James Harden for them, having to undo that move, telling Kyrie he can't play, but then letting him be a part-time player. Like, this is no time to pretend that you're not just the jellyfish of the NBA right now. You chose superstars over culture. That's fine. Stick with it. Like, this is not the time. But I'm sorry. It's just, I don't think the Spurs they could get infinitely better with either one of those guys. If Kevin Durant says, I want to play in San Antonio, I would absolutely think about it, but they don't feel like a team that would touch this situation even tangentially with a 90,000-foot pole. No,
it's like, well, what's Greg Popovich's number one like quality he wants in a player is guys that have gotten over themselves. Are we gonna add Kyrie Irving to this mix?
He didn't put the Spurs on his list, right? He was on Kyrie's list when he was with the Cavs, I think, maybe even the Celtics, but he wasn't on the list now. So,
man, I want to dig up, and I have just as many cold takes as hot ones. I want to dig up the tweet I had of like when Kyrie was talking about, we're going to be a collective head coaching, me and Steve and everybody else. And I think I said this is going to end badly. And it wasn't that long ago for it to be super smart, but it's
you were spot on. So any other targets on the Spurs? I thought if they wanted to get creative, well, it's not creative, but experiment with some of the lower tier guys. Cody Martin, Caleb Martin here. Amir Coffey here. I think I probably prefer the Martin twins. This might be the first time where I don't think Amir Coffey's the perfect fit because the Spurs have like all these 1s, 2s, and 3s running around. And I don't think you can move Coffey around as much positionally as either of the Martin twins. But either of those three guys, if you wanted to try it, they're on the, we'll say, youngish end. I think Coffey's the youngest of those three at 25. And the Martin twins are 26. They could also be a team like, you know, if let's say you're punting on your cap space in a sense, we're not planning on using it. Like instead of a Miles Bridges, like they could go out and sign Otto Porter from the Golden State Warriors if they were looking for a stopgap or a human trade exception. That's the other thing I could see them do because they're operating like more of a normal organization is do they go out and sign players with sort of the intention of we're staying competitive anyway for at least this year with Pop, but if we want to move them at the deadline to get more stuff or as part of a step ladder to a bigger trade, we absolutely can.
Yeah, definitely those kind of guys where you just kind of flex and say, we'll just trade this guy to a contender down the line at some point. Like put them in the mix for any of those guys. I think Warren would make sense as a risk in that regard because maybe he looks great and then you flip him. We haven't even talked about Kyle Anderson coming back home. I feel like just that would be a Spurs thing to do. And if he starts to shoot it a little better, then he's another guy you could flip. Or he just he would have to shoot it well to make sense with Murray, I think. But he's not someone you're necessarily like building into your core. On the other end of the spectrum
here.
What's that?
Jalen Smith here?
Sure. Jalen Smith everywhere. Jalen Smith is my Chris Boucher.
This is the official podcast of Jalen Smith. The thing they do, I guess, have to consider with the front line is what do they view Zach Collins, who actually had some nice moments for them this year, but still feels like more of a flyer, stab in the dark type of player to their future than someone who's, okay, we're not going to spend or we're not going to bring in another person who plays the 4-5 because we're this invested in Zach Collins.
I mean, and they're not that invested is the thing. Cause like, you know, I think it's totally worth just seeing because what is it like 7.3 this year partially, or I don't even know what the guarantee level is in 23-24 of 7.7. It might be totally non-guaranteed.
I believe it is until, let me double check right now on my salary sheets for them. He is guarantees 628 one day after the draft in 2023. He's $7.7 million salary.
So no risk, basically an expiring if it goes sideways. And feels like what were we talking about? Like, let's add a little bit of stretch and a little bit of like athleticism to the front line. It's totally worth seeing how that works.
I say this probably about too many teams, but the Spurs offseason is going to be fascinating because even if they don't do anything major, I just feel like there's like I have an energy about them now again. Yeah. I like the Jeremy Sohan pick. I really like the flyer on Malachi Branham, and I don't know enough about Blake Wesley aside from like the Spurs have now taken flyers on all these sort of like guard types to where it could work out between Primo and Trey Jones. I am in love with Josh Primo. There's like a wiggle, like a water wiggly element to his game that I just really enjoy. They'll be a team to watch. Do you have any final thoughts on them before we skedaddle from this look ahead that went over by quite a bit?
Just to that point that they got a lot of bites at the apple at important positions at like the playmaking guard spot and at the wing spots. So they have a lot of shot. I think that, which at the same time sets them up as a pretty good not that the Spurs ever do this, but as a consolidation trade team where it's like, we got these 2 or 3, you know, prospects that we got enough of. So we're willing to move them and combine some salary. And that would include Pirtle potentially to get the numbers higher, throw a pick in there. And then, you know, if someone shakes loose and it makes sense, like they're a little like Memphis that way, where they can just kind of put together better offers than most teams. So if they don't hit on all these guys, which they won't, they may hit on enough to have some leftovers to move on.
Yeah. I would watch out for them. If there's like the next star that we don't see coming becomes available, I would just watch out for them. The other thing I would say, and I like almost didn't mention this, but like if Charlotte is that concerned and they tried to spin it like they need to trade him to afford Miles Bridges, you can almost just offload Gordon Hayward to San Antonio, who isn't a good value, but makes you better, doesn't upend, I think, any of your development. Is there enough of a sweetener or sweeteners to consider that? Or maybe it's, you know, Josh Richardson for Gordon. You're cutting some, you're not giving up, you're not just taking on $30 million of Gordon Hayward this year. You're taking on 15 or 16 or something like that. I could see the Spurs doing something like that with a team that's worried about its finances or trying to open up space. The Hornets don't need to do either, but they're concerned about the luxury tax.
You build that around Pirtle. I think you build that around Pirtle and like Doug McDermott. And if you want to use Richardson to really match, then great. But I think there's totally ways to do that.
And I bet you, I'm assuming even though the Hornets have Mark Williams and Kai Jones, they'd still be interested.
Oh yeah, no, those guys aren't going to help this year.
Mark Williams might.
Well, but Steve Clifford's going to coach that team. Don't you want like your just ace defensive big in there? Because he wants that team to play defense. And I just like,
well, my whole thing is like, if you're giving up Jakob Poeltl in that deal, maybe you view Doug McDermott as sort of a net negative for you, but like Jakob Poeltl's positive value.
For sure. Yeah. You need to be getting something. You need a lot of sweeteners from Charlotte.
But I would consider something like, they could do anything. In love with the Spurs. Grant, this was great. Are you able to tell us, as always, where our listeners can find you and all the great work? And I mentioned this in the Discord. Grant is going to be on here, basically the co-host of this podcast now. Like, this is becoming a collective podcast. We're excited that he's going to be back frequently. Can you tell them where they can find you and all your great work, which the handles of which will be in the podcast description moving forward as well, to where I won't have to say this anymore.
You can find me writing for Bleacher Report on Twitter, GT_Hughes, and back here more often than in the past. So that's a cool thing. I'm looking forward to doing plenty of these.
Yes, we have 2 more left as of right now. So we will talk to you soon, Grant.